You don't know true silence until it's broken by the wet, sickening snap of your own femur. At 8,000 feet in the unforgiving Bitterroot Mountains, David Miller learned that nature doesn't hate you. It is simply indifferent. And that indifference was about to freeze him to death. David Miller wasn't a novice. At 34, he had bagged over 20 peaks across the Pacific Northwest. He knew the rule of 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, 3 hours without shelter in extreme environments. But on a crisp Tuesday in late October, the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana were about to teach him a lesson about arrogance. He had parked his rusted Subaru at the Boulder Creek trailhead just after dawn. He told his roommate Jacob that he was doing a quick out and back to the ridgeline, a standard 10-mile day. Because it was supposed to be a fast, light hike, David carried only his Osprey Talon 22 backpack. Inside was a single Nalgene bottle, a foil emergency blanket, a half-eaten Cliff Bar, a basic first aid kit, and his lifeline, a Garmin InReach Mini 2 satellite communicator. He wore a mid-weight flannel, a synthetic down vest, and his trusted lower Renegade boots. It was 45 degrees Fahrenheit at the base, crisp, beautiful, and deceiving. By 2 p.m., David was 2 miles off the main trail, chasing a better vantage point for his photography along an unnamed jagged scree field. The view of the distant snow-capped peaks was intoxicating. He took a step onto a massive granite slab that looked as solid as a bank vault. It wasn't. The earth gave way with a deep, grinding groan. David had less than a second to react before the world tilted. He scrambled backward, but the shifting boulder clipped his left boot, sweeping his legs out from under him. He cascaded down the steep, razor-sharp scree, tumbling uncontrollably over a drop-off. He fell perhaps 15 feet, but the landing was catastrophic. His right leg slipped into a narrow fissure between 2 immovable slabs of granite, just as his upper body violently twisted downhill. The sound was like a heavy tree branch snapping in a quiet forest. David screamed a raw, primal sound that was instantly swallowed by the vast emptiness of the valley. He lay on his back, staring up at the painfully blue sky, his chest heaving as a wave of nausea washed over him. For a full minute he couldn't move. The shock flooded his system, a numbing blanket of adrenaline that temporarily masked the true horror of his situation. Slowly, agonizingly, he propped himself up on his elbows. He looked down at his right leg. It was bent at an impossible, grotesque angle just above the boot. Worse, the heavy denim of his hiking pants was rapidly staining with dark arterial crimson. A jagged ivory shard of his tibia had pierced the skin and fabric. It was a compound fracture. Okay, calm down, David muttered aloud, his voice trembling violently. You have the Garmin. Just hit the SOS. He reached a shaking hand over his shoulder to the strap of his Osprey pack, where the satellite communicator was clipped. His fingers met jagged plastic and exposed wires. During the fall, the device had taken a direct, crushing blow against a boulder. The screen was shattered into a spiderweb of dead pixels, and the housing was split open. The SOS button was obliterated. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the adrenaline. He was at least 7 miles from the trailhead. He was completely off the designated path. Jacob didn't expect him back until 8 p.m., and even then search and rescue wouldn't launch a full operation until the following morning. By tomorrow morning, the temperature was forecasted to drop to 15 degrees. David looked at the sun, which was already beginning its descent behind the jagged peaks to the west. The shadows were elongating, crawling across the rocky basin like dark fingers. With the setting sun, the temperature was already plummeting. The wind previously, a gentle breeze, now carried the biting chill of impending winter. He had to stop the bleeding, and he had to stabilize the leg. Gritting his teeth against a sudden white-hot flare of agony, David unzipped his pack. He pulled out the meager first aid kit. He used his pocket knife to cut away the blood-soaked denim around the wound. The sight of the bone made him gag, but he forced himself to focus. He wrapped a sterile trauma pad around the protrusion, then used a torn strip of his flannel shirt as a makeshift tourniquet, above the knee, tightening it just enough to slow the bleeding without killing the limb entirely. Next came the splint. He unclipped his black diamond trekking poles from his pack. Extending them, he placed one on either side of his broken leg. He used the remaining strips of his flannel and his spare bootlaces to bind the poles to his leg, creating a rigid, albeit agonizing brace. Every slight movement sent a shock wave of pain up his spine that made his vision gray out. When he was finished, he lay back, utterly exhausted. He looked at his watch, 3:45 p.m. The wind howled a low, mournful sound through the pines below the scree field. The cold was already seeping through his down vest. He remembered a topographical map he had studied at the ranger station months ago. About 1.5 miles down this specific drainage basin, nestled near a creek, there was a small black square, an old, forgotten line cabin used by fur trappers in the 1920s. He had no idea if it was still standing, or if it even had 4 walls, but it was his only chance. Lying there meant freezing to death under the indifferent stars. Moving meant excruciating, unfathomable pain. David rolled onto his stomach. He dug his elbows into the dirt and rocks. He dragged his stabilized, dead-weight leg behind him, feeling the agonizing shift of the broken bone with every inch. He began to crawl. The first 100 yards took an hour. Every time David pulled himself forward with his forearms, his broken right leg dragged across the uneven terrain. Even with the trekking pole splint, the broken ends of his tibia ground against each other, a sickening internal friction that threatened to send him into shock. He developed a rhythm born of desperation: plant elbows, pull upper body, grit teeth, whimper rest for 10 seconds. Repeat. By 5:30 p.m., the sun vanished behind the Bitterroot Ridge. The transition from day to night in the mountains isn't gradual. It's a sudden heavy curtain dropping. The temperature plummeted from 40 degrees down into the 20s. Frost began to crystallize on the edges of the pine needles. David's elbows were torn to shreds. His forearms, clad only in the tattered remains of his flannel, were scraped raw, weeping blood that quickly froze in the frigid air. The pain in his leg had transitioned from a sharp, stabbing agony into a deep, throbbing, all-consuming fire that radiated up to his chest, just to the tree line. He whispered to himself, his breath pluming in white clouds. Just get to the trees. He dragged himself over a massive, exposed tree root, his splint catching on the wood. The jolt ripped a scream from his throat, echoing through the darkening forest. He collapsed face first into the freezing dirt, tears streaming down his dirt-caked face. For a moment, he let himself rest. The cold ground felt soothing against his feverish skin. Just close your eyes, a treacherous voice in his mind whispered. Just for a minute. It doesn't hurt as much when you rest. He knew what that voice was. Hypothermia. His body was shutting down, pulling warm blood away from his extremities to protect his organs. His violent shivering, which had racked his frame for the last hour, was beginning to subside. That was the most dangerous sign of all. Once the shivering stopped, the apathy would set in, followed by a warm, sleepy delusion, and then death. David forced his eyes open. He pushed up with arms that felt like lead. He kept moving. Hours bled into one another. The moon rose a pale, unsympathetic crescent, casting long, eerie shadows through the dense canopy of lodgepole pines. David was no longer crawling so much as writhing forward. His mind began to fracture under the weight of exhaustion and pain. He hallucinated Jacob walking beside him, telling him to hurry up because the pizza was getting cold. He saw headlights flashing through the trees, only to realize they were just the moonlight reflecting off patches of early frost. Then he smelled it. At first he thought it was another hallucination, a phantom scent conjured by his dying brain. But he stopped flaring his nostrils. It wasn't the fresh, sharp scent of pine needles. It was old wood. Creosote, the distinct metallic tang of an old wood stove. He dragged himself another 20 yards, cresting a small ridge overlooking the creek bed. There, bathed in the moonlight, was the cabin. It was small, built of heavy, rough-hewn timber, its corrugated tin roof rusted and sagging in the middle. It looked ancient, half swallowed by the wilderness. But to David it was the most beautiful structure he had ever seen. He scrambled down the slope, driven by a final desperate surge of adrenaline. He reached the front porch, pulling himself up the 2 rotting wooden steps. He reached for the heavy iron door handle and pressed the latch. It didn't move. A heavy modern steel padlock hung securely from a heavy-duty hasp. Despair hit him like a physical blow. He slumped against the door, slamming his fist against the solid oak. "No, no, please!" He sobbed, his voice weak and hoarse. He had crawled through hell, dragging a shattered limb, only to be locked out to freeze on a porch. But the survival instinct is a relentless engine. David wiped his face, leaving smears of mud and dried blood across his cheeks. He dragged himself around the perimeter of the cabin. On the back wall, facing the creek, there was a small square window. The glass was filthy, but more importantly, one of the panes was shattered, a jagged hole large enough to fit a fist through. David reached up, ignoring the glass, biting into his wrist, and blindly felt for the latch. His numbed fingers fumbled, but he finally found the simple hook-and-eye mechanism. He flipped it up and pushed. The wooden window frame groaned in protest, but it swung inward. Hauling himself through a window 3 feet off the ground with a compound leg fracture was an exercise in pure torture. He led with his head and shoulders tumbling awkwardly onto the dusty wooden floorboards inside, dragging his splintered leg in after him with a sickening thud. He lay on the floor for a long time, gasping for air in the pitch-black cabin. It was freezing inside, but crucially it was out of the wind. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the faint moonlight filtering through the window revealed the interior. It was a single room. In the center sat a heavy cast-iron pot-belly stove. Against the far wall was a crude wooden table and a rusted cot with a bare mattress. David dragged himself to the stove. He unlatched the heavy iron door and reached inside. There were ashes, but they were stone cold. However, stacked neatly next to the stove was a small pile of split kindling and dry logs. Beside that, a miracle, a small red plastic box of Diamond Strike Anywhere matches. His hands shook so violently, he dropped the first 3 matches. On the 4th try, it flared to life, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. He shoved the match into a crumpled piece of old newspaper under the kindling. The paper caught. The small sticks began to pop and crackle. Warmth. Actual radiating warmth. David dragged himself closer, practically hugging the cast iron, letting the heat seep into his frozen, trembling body. He had done it. He had survived the crawl. He had found shelter and fire. He leaned his head back against the leg of the heavy wooden table, letting out a long, ragged exhale of pure relief. He survived the night. Tomorrow he would figure out a way to signal for help. But as the fire grew brighter, illuminating the dark corners of the cabin, David's relief turned to ice water in his veins. The cabin wasn't abandoned. Now that the room was lit, he could see the details he had missed in the dark. Tacked to the walls were highly detailed topographical maps of the surrounding mountains, but they were aggressively marked up with red Sharpie circles, X's, and frantic scribbled notes that looked like a cipher. But that wasn't what made his heart stop. On the table directly above him, bathed in the firelight, was an open can of baked beans. A metal spoon rested inside it. The beans weren't dusty. The metal spoon was clean, and beside the can an insulated thermos sat with its cap unscrewed. A faint wisp of steam was still rising from its rim. Whoever lived here hadn't abandoned the cabin decades ago. They had just stepped out. And suddenly, over the crackle of the wood stove, David heard it. The heavy, unmistakable crunch of boots stepping onto the front porch. Then a hand grabbed the locked front doorknob, rattling it violently. The heavy padlock outside didn't just rattle, it chimed with the terrifying jingle of a key ring. David's breath hitched in his throat. He scrambled backward, dragging his shattered leg across the floorboards, leaving a fresh, dark smear of blood in his wake. He pressed his back against the rough timber wall, sliding his hand into his pocket to grip his small, folding pocket knife. It was a pathetic weapon against whatever or whoever was about to walk through that door. The lock clicked. The heavy iron latch lifted, and the door was kicked open violently, letting in a swirling gust of freezing wind and snow. A man stood in the threshold, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. He was massive, easily 6'4", draped in a heavy grease-stained canvas coat and a fur trapper hat. But it wasn't his size that made David's blood run cold. It was the lever-action Winchester rifle gripped tightly in his thick, leather-gloved hands. The man stepped inside, kicking the door shut behind him with the heel of his boot. He leveled the rifle directly at David's chest. The firelight caught the stranger's face, a thick, tangled beard, framing eyes that were wide, wild, and incredibly paranoid. "Who sent you?" The man's voice was a low, gravelly bark that rattled in his chest. "Feds, state wardens. Nobody." David choked out, dropping his pocket knife to the floor. He raised both hands, shaking violently. "Nobody sent me, I fell. I fell off the scree field up the ridge. My leg is broken. Please don't shoot." The man whose name David would later learn was Caleb Mercer didn't lower the gun. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes darting toward the shattered window, then to the lit stove, and finally down to David's right leg. The makeshift splint of trekking poles and bloody flannel was undeniable evidence. Caleb slowly lowered the barrel of the Winchester, though his finger remained hovering dangerously close to the trigger guard. He pulled off his heavy gloves, revealing hands calloused and scarred from years of hard labor. "You broke my window," Caleb said flatly. "I was freezing to death." David wheezed. The adrenaline spike was beginning to fade, and the agonizing, rhythmic thumping in his leg was returning with a vengeance. I think I crawled for miles. I just saw the cabin. I didn't know anyone lived here." Caleb walked over to the table, ignoring David for a moment. He picked up the thermos of hot coffee, unscrewed the cup, and took a long sip, his eyes never leaving David. The tension in the room was suffocating. The maps on the wall, the isolation, the drawn gun. It all painted a terrifying picture. Caleb wasn't just living off the grid. He was hiding from something. "You got a radio on you?" Caleb asked, stepping closer and using the toe of his boot to kick David's backpack out of reach. "A Garmin satellite messenger," David said. "But it's smashed. I fell on it. It's in the top pocket, look for yourself." Caleb knelt, keeping the rifle tucked under his arm, and unzipped the pack. He pulled out the shattered plastic housing of the Garmin, grunting in what sounded like satisfaction. He tossed it into the fire. The lithium battery sizzled and popped. "Hey, that was my only." "You don't need it," Caleb interrupted coldly, "because nobody is coming here. He stepped over to David and knelt beside the ruined leg. Without warning, Caleb gripped the bloody flannel wrapping. David screamed as Caleb pulled the fabric back to expose the compound fracture. The bone had shifted again during the crawl through the window. The skin around the ivory shard was angry red and swollen tight. You got about 4 hours before the infection in the marrow hits your bloodstream, Caleb muttered, his tone shifting from angry paranoia to grim clinical assessment. Once sepsis sets in, you'll spike a fever, go delirious, and your organs will shut down. You won't make it to sunrise. Can you help me? David begged, tears of pain blurring his vision. Can you go to the trailhead? Get rescue. Caleb stood up, walking to a small wooden chest at the foot of his cot. I don't go to town, and I don't talk to rangers. He opened the chest and pulled out a large, battered metal first aid box with a faded red cross on it. It was military surplus. Why not? David asked, his teeth chattering from a fresh wave of chills. Caleb stopped and looked over his shoulder, the firelight casting deep, menacing shadows across his scarred face. Because I got federal warrants out of Missoula. Aggravated assault. 3 years ago. The world thinks Caleb Mercer drowned in the Clark Fork River, and I intend to keep it that way. He walked back to David, dropping the metal box on the floor. He opened it, revealing an array of professional medical supplies, sealed bandages, iodine, a surgical stapler, and a bottle of clear liquid. I was a combat medic in Kandahar, Caleb said, uncapping the bottle. It smelled like high-proof moonshine. I can set this, and I can clean it. But if I do, you're a problem. You know my face, and you know my grid coordinates. David's heart hammered against his ribs. The implication was clear. Caleb was weighing the moral cost of letting a man die against the risk of going to federal prison. I won't say anything, David said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. I swear to God, if you get me to a road, I'll tell them I dragged myself the whole way. I'll say I found an empty cave. I'll never mention this cabin. Caleb poured the moonshine onto a clean rag. Words are cheap when you're bleeding out on a floorboard. I have money in my wallet, David pleaded. Take it. Take my camera gear. It's worth $4 grand. Just, please. I don't want to die here. Caleb stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose tin on the roof. Finally, the massive man sighed a heavy sound of resignation. Bite down on this, Caleb commanded, shoving a thick leather belt toward David's mouth. When I pour this alcohol over the bone, you're going to want to scream. Don't. The noise travels down the valley. David put the leather between his teeth. He nodded. Caleb gripped David's ankle with one massive hand and the protruding bone with the other. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. Caleb brutally yanked the leg straight while pushing the jagged shard of tibia back under the skin. David bit down so hard he tasted blood. A blinding, white-hot explosion of agony radiated behind his eyes. The world tilted, the firelight swam, and then mercifully the darkness rushed in to swallow him whole. When David regained consciousness, the world was a hazy grey blur. He was lying on the cot. The fire in the stove was reduced to glowing orange embers. He looked down at his right leg. It was encased in a flawless, rigid splint made of carved pine branches and tightly wrapped canvas strips. The smell of iodine and cheap whiskey hung heavy in the air. Drink, a gruff voice ordered. Caleb was sitting at the table cleaning his rifle. He pushed a tin cup across the wood. David reached for it with trembling hands. It was water laced with sugar and salt. He drank it greedily. You've been out for 10 hours, Caleb said, not looking up from his weapon. Fever broke about an hour ago. The infection hasn't reached your blood yet, but it will. I pumped you full of the last of my broad-spectrum antibiotics, but it's a temporary fix." "Thank you," David whispered hoarsely. Caleb stood up and grabbed a heavy canvas tarp from the corner. "Don't thank me yet. We have a 5-mile hike to the logging road, and you're dead weight." For the next hour, Caleb worked in silence. He took 2 long, sturdy branches and lashed the canvas tarp between them, creating a crude, Native American-style travois. He dragged it into the cabin and roughly hauled David off the cot and onto the canvas. Before securing him, Caleb reached into David's backpack. He pulled out the expensive Sony mirrorless camera, the spare lenses, and David's wallet. He pocketed all of it. "Insurance," Caleb said simply. "You tell the sheriffs about me. I mail your driver's license to a cartel buddy in Juarez, and they come pay your roommate Jacob a visit." "Understood." David nodded weakly. He didn't care about the gear or the threats. He just wanted to live. Caleb strapped David to the travois, stepped into a heavy harness, and began to pull. The journey was a blur of freezing wind, bouncing bumps and jarring pain. Caleb dragged him through thick, snow-covered underbrush, over fallen logs, and across a freezing, knee-deep creek. The man possessed superhuman stamina, fueled by the sheer terror of being discovered. Every time David groaned, Caleb hushed him violently. By noon, the trees began to thin. The sound of a distant roaring engine echoed through the pines. Caleb stopped abruptly. He unclipped the harness and dropped the poles of the travois. They had reached the edge of a wide, dirt logging road. Fresh tire tracks cut through the light dusting of snow. "This is it," Caleb said, his chest heaving. "A Weyerhaeuser timber truck comes down this road every day at 12:30 p.m., heading to the mill. You wait here. He'll see you." David looked up at his savior and captor. "I keep my promises, Caleb." Caleb didn't smile. He looked down at the broken man on the sled, his expression unreadable. "You better." Without another word, the massive hermit turned and vanished into the dense, dark timber. Within seconds, it was as if he had never existed. 10 minutes later, the massive grille of a yellow timber truck crested the hill. The driver slammed on the air brakes, the massive vehicle sliding to a halt in the snow just feet from where David lay. The driver jumped out, radioing for a medevac, before he even reached David's side. The next few days were a chaotic whirlwind. The helicopter flight to Missoula, the emergency surgery to install titanium plates, and 9 screws into his shattered tibia. The heavy dose of IV morphine that made the hospital ceiling tiles look like dancing clouds. When the local sheriff finally came to take his statement, David stuck to his story. He told them he fell, built his own splint, and dragged himself for miles through the snow until he reached the logging road. He told them he lost his pack and his camera in the river. The sheriff looked at the flawless, expertly tied canvas splint they had cut off his leg in the ER. He looked at David. "You tie those knots yourself, son." "Boy Scout." David lied without blinking. The sheriff closed his notepad. He knew it was a lie, but a rescued hiker was a closed case. He didn't push it. A week later, David was discharged. He was sitting in a wheelchair in his apartment, looking out the window at the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots. He reached into the pocket of the bloody, torn-down vest the hospital staff had bagged up for him. His fingers brushed against something small and hard. He pulled it out. It was the SD card from his Sony camera. Caleb had taken the expensive gear to sell and the wallet for leverage. But in the final moments before strapping David to the sled, the wanted fugitive had taken the time to pop out the memory card and slip it into David's pocket. He had saved David's life, and he had saved his art. David looked at the tiny plastic square, then out toward the vast, indifferent mountains. Out there, hidden in the unforgiving wilderness, was a monster to society who had been a savior to him. And David Miller knew he would take that secret to his grave. If this story of surviving the impossible kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your hiking buddies to remind them how quickly nature can turn. What would you have done if you met Caleb? Let me know in the comments below, and stay tuned for more incredible true survival stories.